Hello, I'm Kate Fitzgerald from the Learning Hack team, welcoming you to a new episode of Great Minds on Learning. In this highly acclaimed series, Professor Donald Clark, internationally famous author, blogger and entrepreneur, joins John Helmer to explore 2,500 years of thought and theorising about learning from the Greeks to the geeks. This episode was recorded in front of a live audience at the Performance Journey Goes Dutch conference in Ermelo, the Netherlands, organised by Xpertise Learning. Donald and John explore a group of theorists who are giving us a new picture of how we think and learn that is distinctively different from what came before. They're the Connectionists, and they see the brain as flatter than was previously thought, constantly trying to predict what will happen next and to improvise a response. But what are the implications for learning of this new psychology?
So philosophy, psychology, psychotherapy, neuroscience, have they got the brain all wrong? That's the dangerous idea we'll be exploring today in the company of my esteemed co-host Donald Clark, who's going to tell us about the new psychology, which reflects a real and growing interdisciplinary approach in cognitive science and neuroscience. It's not easy to say this stuff, you know. So welcome to this episode of Great Minds on Learning, recorded live here at the Performance Journey Goes Dutch conference in the Netherlands, and thanks very much for Alfred Remetz for hosting us. Now, this new paradigm of thinking about the brain has influenced various fields, including artificial intelligence, psychology, and psychiatry. If you want a simple way to sum it all up, one of the theorists we're covering here today, Nick Chater, has done that in the title of his book, The Mind is Flat, The Illusion of Mental Depth and the Improvised Mind. To put it perhaps crudely, he says there's no depth to the mind, we're all just making it up as we go along, like podcasters. So we're all mini podcasters. Donald, you're calling these theorists connectionists and arguing that this new psychology is a significant shift in understanding brain function and cognition. Clearly, this has implications for learning. But before we get into that, can you give us the roots of this idea? Can you give us the kind of background, where it came from? And I know we're going to have three philosophers in the introduction, including David Hume, your hero.
Yep.
But also some great minds we've covered before in episodes about AI.
Yeah. Well, these new kids on the block have really sort of starting to revolutionize what we know traditionally as psychology. We've been in an era where cognitive psychology was dominant, before that behaviorism. And they're called the Connectionists. And a wee bit of history, because we did another podcast on this some time back. There was a guy called Hebb that you may have heard of, and there's a theory called Hebbian learning, which turned out to be true. And he was a school teacher and a psychologist. And he noticed that his kids were, a wider range of subjects they taught them, they seemed to be better and made more progress as they went on. And his famous line was, neurons that fire together, wire together. In other words, the more you stimulate the brain, the more connected the brain becomes and the better it becomes at solving problems. Okay? Fire together, they wire together. That was Hebb's. Then along came two other characters called McCulloch and Pitts. Pitts was a homeless guy. He was literally homeless, and he was a genius mathematician. Never published anything. He didn't even use his own name because he thought it was just a symbol. He was like a quite autistic guy, but a genius. And they took the Hebb's idea of a neuron in the brain, because that's what we have in our brain. We have 100 billion of them. The most complex thing in the whole universe is this. And they applied mathematics to it. They actually worked out that a neuron actually passes information on to other neurons, okay? So they applied the Boolean logic, so, and or type logic to the neuron. And you have a threshold. As soon as it reaches a threshold, it passes that on to the next neuron. That's the wiring together. It was a big breakthrough, because once you've got a neuron in mathematics, you can put it in a computer and mimic a neuron, and mimic how neurons work. Okay? Then a guy called Rosenblatt comes along and builds a thing called the perceptron. He actually builds a set of connected neurons and has a 400 pixel, 20 by 20 pixel thing that recognizes a rabbit or a dog. And it actually is the first machine ever that could learn. So all these guys, this was steadily heading towards artificial intelligence, because we then have Geoffrey Hinton, who his grandfather was Boolean logic, that stuff, another genius mathematician, very strange guy, aren't we all? And then he manages to come along and invent a thing called back propagation that we may talk about later. But he's called the grandfather of AI, and boy, is he the one person that you point to go who created the whole AI. So we had all these people who were looking at this and building AI based on it. Now we have people who are looking at AI and using the AI theory and mathematics of AI to wonder how this works. It's sort of flipped.
I should point out for the tape that Donald is pointing to the brain he's brought along with him, a small foam rubber brain.
Yeah, not my brain, a small foam one, bought in Tiger
Audio.
for €4. By the way, who buys a brain? When I walked into Tiger and saw this, I go, who buys brains? Me. I'm the only person on the planet, probably. But there we are. So this notion of flipping psychology was a really big thing for me when I first came across it. And I started doing a lot of reading behind it and so on. Because these people see the brain as so they believe in the computational model of the brain. And knows the brain is a computer. It doesn't mean it's like your computer, your laptop, or your smartphone. They just think that it operates in a similar fashion using algorithmic principles. So a good example of that, the one they all believe in, is a thing called Bayesian prediction. So you don't have to worry about the detail. But Bayes, who was an English priest, 18th century priest, came up with this mathematical formula, basically, that says, okay, I have prior knowledge, I know X, Y, and Z, I get new data, I have to update my state, they're called priors. I have to update it as I move through the world. This happens in real time. That's how you manage to walk through a door. And you know this is true because you know those optical illusions where you see the Necker cube and your brain can flip it? Because when the brain hits something and it doesn't quite understand what it is, it's predicting what it should be. And then it clicks in and you go, oh, I see it now, it comes out. Or that face that turns around and you find it's not hollow, it's actually this way. So the brain is an active projecting. Psychology has always treated the brain as something that just receives sensory data. Yeah. It's a very passive receptive thing. That's the model we have in our heads of the brain. It turns out to be the opposite. It's actually a seeking, projecting, predicting organ. Right. And that's what these people have focused on.
And what do the philosophers say about this?
Right. Now, that's good, because that's my thing. That's my subject.
Well, I've advanced the slide, you see.
Oh, you got the slide behind, sorry. So, there was a bunch of philosophers, starting with David Hume, who was Scottish from Edinburgh. Very famously, they didn't give him, he was the most famous philosopher in Europe, and the university didn't give him the professorship because he didn't believe in God. That's Edinburgh for you. That's Scottish Presbyterianism for you, which I know well. Anyway, David Hume was a skeptic. He also wrote extensively about the brain and psychology. He was a sort of psychologist come philosopher. He thought that studying human nature and the brain was really important. And one of the things he asked himself was, what is this? What are we? What are you as a person? If you say, what am I? What is my identity? And he says, when you think about it, all you've got in life is a sort of running river of perceptions. You know, you can never catch yourself out, say, what am I? Because you're always just getting perceptions. You have perceptions of your feelings in your own body, you have perceptions of other people, perceptions of the world, but that's all it is. So he was an empiricist who believed that everything came from just sensory data. And he actually didn't believe there was a self. This may sound a bit weird. He thought when you look for the self or soul, it doesn't really exist. There is no ghost in the machine, which most modern AI people also believe. There is no soul. Of course, this is why he didn't get his professorship. And there was very famously on the mound in Edinburgh, he fell over. He was a great big rotund guy. He loved wine and food. He fell over, and a woman who passed him wouldn't pick him up because he didn't believe in God. It was a famous anecdote of his. But so he didn't believe there was such a thing as personal identity as such. It was just a succession. Then a guy called Derek Parfit comes along, and he says much the same thing, to be honest. And then Galen Strawson's a really interesting guy. He's at the University of Austin. There's a lot of people who think that your personal identity are the stories you have of yourself. Like, I'm Donald, I'm Scottish, I grew up near Edinburgh, I moved to Brighton, I have 2 kids, blah, 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 you know. So it's called the storied self. He thinks that's bullshit as well. He thinks that's just, actually it's wrong, because actually you invent things about yourself. He thinks that's really dangerous, in fact, the storied self. It's a really interesting thing. If you give lots of these talks, people introduce you, you know, on the stage, and you listen to them and go, that sounds a bit, because they only give the good bits, you know. They never tell you the bad bits. Oh, we had a successful business. Well, what about the one that failed? That sort of stuff, So you always get the peaks, not because we tell ourselves positive stories about ourselves. We invent ourselves. He's a very interesting guy. So he goes one stage further and says, actually, it's not just that we don't have personal identity. We actually have a completely false or faux. It's a hoax. You know what you think of yourself? It's actually made up. I have a lot of sympathy with that view. The older I've got, you get a wee bit more honest about yourself, you think, maybe in other people. So those three philosophers were key on this. And some of them, the humane tradition, which is there's no ghost in the machine.
Yeah.
That leads to the computational model of the brain, because the brain's basically a computer, like a black box.
That's the Humean.
Humane tradition.
It's not the humane.
Not the humane, no.
Yeah.
Or human, no. Humean.
Yeah. Got to be careful with these things.
You do indeed, indeed. Yeah.
So that's given us a great background. Let's move into the detail with the first of you that we're going to come up.
Yeah.
And as you're starting on this, I'm going to swap chairs because yours is squeaking. You can't have a squeaky chair on a podcast.
I hope you're not going to edit that out, because that's live.
Yeah, no, I'll keep that in for live Atmos. So, Daniel Dennett was born in Boston, Massachusetts, raised in the Lebanon. Due to his father's diplomatic service, he pursued philosophy at Harvard University and later earned his DPhil from the University of Oxford under Gilbert Ryle. Dennett taught at Tufts University, where he became a prominent figure in the philosophy of mind and cognitive science. He authored influential books like Consciousness Explained. Dennett sadly died this April and was kind of working right up to the end. There are some very recent YouTubes of his where actually he slags off large language models.
Yeah.
But in life, he was an avid sailor, fun fact, and often drew parallels in his work between sailing and philosophical inquiry. As we cast off the stern and bow lines and pull away from the harbour into these uncharted waters, Donald, chart us a course with Daniel Dennett.
Yeah, so Daniel Dennett's a big hero of mine, and he wrote a book called Darwin's Dangerous Idea. He thought that Darwin's theory of evolution was the most profound and, well, actually, the theory that had most causal effect on all other disciplines. He's a multidisciplinary guy: philosophy, psychology, evolutionary theory, mathematics. He's a good linguist, language theory, and also artificial intelligence. But he said something really simple. He said, this damn thing is an evolved organ. And because it's an evolved organ, it has adapted to things that we no longer need to worry about. We don't really have to worry about being eaten by a saber-toothed tiger when we go for our lunch. So we have this, fear and flight type stuff that's actually not quite harmful. Actually, in the learning area, there are people who've studied emotions, Pansett, and we did a whole podcast on that. Actually, a lot of the emotions that you might want in learning that come from our evolutionary past are fear is a good one. Fear is a terrible thing in learning. When a kid is scared in the classroom of failing in an exam, it's a really destructive emotion. And a lot of people have really got emotion wrong in learning, I think. They think emotions are always good. No, they're often bad. That's why I don't like gamification very much, because it overstimulates the brain, and therefore you concentrate on the scoring and all that and not on the deep learning. But that's another story. But back to Dennett. So that was the first book, 1995. And then his masterpiece really is Consciousness Explained. When you're sitting here looking at us now, and you've got this internal theatre, you see me, you see the room. Remember, you're not actually seeing the room. You're actually reconstructing that. When all this visual data goes into your eyes, it's actually going in upside down. So in your brain has to flip it the right way up. It's pretty weird, this. Nobody thinks about it, but it's true. So, and then once it goes into the brain completely makes it up again. So it's like an internal theatre you have in your mind. We don't think about this. We think we've got like an X-ray vision that just projects out onto those walls. No, it's the other way around. We actually build something. So actually we have a VR machine really that creates consciousness. But he said that VR machine is just it's a waste of time. It's just the internal theatre. All the work goes on behind the scenes in the computer, the computational model of the mind.
Yeah.
So he focuses very much on that. And he was the first to really go into detail about this Bayesian model. In other words, you have existing data, existing beliefs. This is relevant for learning people. So any learner has an existing set of knowledge and skills. And you've got to update that model, which is really hard, as we know, because they forget everything and it's really hard to teach. But if you look at the Bayesian structure, actually that explains why it's hard, because people hold on to their prior beliefs, and you've got to knock them into the new set of data and update it from prior to posterior. It's got the mathematics of it all. He was the first to unpack that, really. Yeah. He was also the person who looked at active inference. So the brain actually doesn't see the whole room. Funnily enough, in perception, you may think you're seeing this room in colour, but it's actually called the funnel of experience. You actually, on your peripheral vision, it's actually black and white when you test people, but you think it's colour. It's a weird thing. And you also sample. You only pay attention to one thing at a time. The Gestalt people were all wrong. So I'm looking at this bottle. I'm not actually seeing you. And the mind has an attention. There's a big thing in AI, an attention. That's why it works. It can focus attention on one thing at a time, and it can only ever do one thing at a time normally. So that was a big deal. And he, of course, learnt all that from artificial intelligence and wrote a fantastic book that I highly recommend called From Bacteria to Bach, Composer, and Back Again. It's a terrible title, but a brilliant book. And he unpacks all this. He brings all these multidisciplinary things together to explain what this new psychology is. Yeah. It's a really wonderful book, and it's readable, unlike Daniel Kahneman's book that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
So,
I've got a question about that. I mean, we talk about the computational model of the mind, and that starts with the cognitivists in the 60s, the 1960s.
It does, yeah.
Obviously, the power of computers and what they can do and what we think of as being a computer has changed a lot. And now with AI, it's changing a lot. So does that change the model? I mean, if Dennett is talking about a computational model of the mind, he's talking about a very different sort of computer from those people back in the 60s.
Oh, and that's exactly the point of this podcast, John. This is a really good question, because it's not as if the brain is a computer like this one. That's not what these people are saying. Yeah. They're saying that it has computational mechanisms that may be similar to, may not be the same, but once you accept the fact that it does much the same as the software on the chips and motherboard of this computer, it does that. It'll do it differently because it's a biological substrate, not a silicon substrate. But once you accept the fact that there are mathematical algorithmic principles behind it, then your question is great, because along comes large language models. And we go, holy shit, this seems like a human being. I'm speaking to somebody for real here. Because suddenly, the mathematics of a large language model mimics, and it's very shallow. These large language models, you can actually download them onto this computer. And nobody quite knows why it worked. We just trained it with loads of data, and it started speaking to us. It freaked people out. Even the people in AI, System say, when they were in OpenAI, they were sort of astonished. Geoffrey Hinton, they couldn't believe that this was happening. And so suddenly we go, well, if that's true, let's look at the brain again. Maybe it's much flatter and simpler than we might imagine. And this is why I like these people, because they're saying, all that Freudian stuff, like underneath here somewhere is an id, an ego, or a superego, as if it's some sort of deep pool down here with all these weird creatures in it that control your action. They're basically saying that's bullshit. They're saying, actually, it's sort of like a computer, but we don't have any access to how it works. Like that Mac doesn't know how its circuit boards work. It can't tell you that. And neither can we tell ourselves how this works. But we know it does. But the large language models and the stuff that's coming out is giving us clues, because large language models came because Geoffrey Hinton studied this. We took our inspiration from this to create them, and now we're taking inspiration from the large language models and looking back at the brain again. Isn't it weird that this thing evolved just to sort of stop being eaten by saber-toothed tigers and also to kill things so we could eat? And it suddenly has created a piece of technology that allows it to examine itself and create a piece of technology that's better than itself. That sort of blows my mind a little bit.
Yeah. I have a piece of technology that can move us on to the next slide. Shall I use it now?
A clicker.
I've got to keep things running. And you've been talking about Hinton, so let's get into it.
Oh, Geoffrey, yeah. Great. I love Hinton.
Geoffrey Hinton was born in Wimbledon, London, grew up in Bristol, studied experimental psychology at the University of Cambridge, and earned his PhD in artificial intelligence from the University of Edinburgh. Hinton's career includes teaching at Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Toronto, where he became known as a pioneer of deep learning and neural networks. I wonder if companies like DeepMind have to rename themselves if we find out that the mind is flatter than we thought, but never mind.
Flatmind.
Yeah, Flatmind, yeah. Hinton's, fun fact here, Hinton's great-great-grandfather was George Boole, the mathematician who developed Boolean algebra. I might edit that out because you already told them that. Hinton hit the headlines a year ago when he resigned from Google and raised fears about the dangers of AI, saying that he partly regretted his life work. This is a weird world that we're in now where it's the people who actually know about AI who are raising concerns about it, not just heads of HR. But Donald, what part does Hinton have to play in the story that we're telling here?
Yeah, well, Geoffrey Hinton was a sort of genius, really, and he did a degree in psychology. He was a sort of neuroscientist psychologist originally at Cambridge, and then he got that degree and he left. He became a carpenter for 6 years. This was weird. One of the smartest people on the planet. He went out because he was fed up with it, really. And then he did loads of reading in Islington Library, and he was fascinated by the brain. It had always puzzled him. It's like a black box, as I said earlier. He said, well, we don't know anything about this damn thing. And he's smart. So he on his own, for about 6 years, he studied. And then he went to do a PhD in Edinburgh and changed the world forever. So he wrote one of the most famous papers. In 1986, he writes this paper, Learning Representations by Backpropagation Errors. So this is the paper. Like people like Callum, who has a degree in AI, like that's the first paper you get to know about. He has this thing called backpropagation, which is actually quite difficult to explain. But if you imagine going up a mountain and you're blind and you just step your foot around and you find the highest point and you step forward, right? Being blind, that's an algorithm for climbing the mountain. Okay, you just because you're always going up. You get to the top. You might think that's true, but actually, what if it's just a dip and you go down again and go into the valley? It's complicated. But coming back down is interesting. So coming back down, you can step down and that's lower. I'll go down, and you'll eventually get down the mountain. But if you actually calculate the errors when you're coming down and change the weightings, you can learn from that experience. And if you do it very, very fast, you can do amazing things. It's a weird thing, but it's backpropagation. He invents this with Susper and some very famous people in AI, and it changes the world forever. You don't have any of this AI without that paper. None of it. Because backpropagation is central to large language models and these big transformers. So he does that, changes the world, goes to work at Google. When they first invent this thing, they enter a competition called NetTalk, which was like a text-to-speech thing. And they go into the competition and they beat everybody by a golden mile. This thing is so good. And people were astonished. How did you do that? And all they did was scale the model. They just fed it, they just trained it with more and more data with this backpropagation thing behind it. And that gave them the clue. Scale matters. That's why you've got these big language models trained by this enormous amount of data. Oh. He then leaves Google in 2023. And he's become very philosophical, but I think he may be in his late 70s now. I think he's decided, I've had enough academia. I'm going to try and tackle big issues and ethical issues. But one of the things he's looked at is the mortal computer. Interesting idea, this. So this thing runs on about 20 amps. It's a low power machine. That's why you have to have a cake at lunchtime, because you've got to keep this thing going. Most of your energy goes into your brain, not your muscles. But it's a low-power machine, but it's brilliant. On low power, try running a large language model, and you're sort of using the power of a small country. So he's looked at a mortal computer. Suppose we took some of the cells, real neurons from a real brain, grew them in a petri dish, and combined them with the digital technology we've got. Perhaps we could get the best of both worlds. So he's looking at a mortal computer, which is a marvelous idea. So he may even change the world again. You'd be a genius twice over if he gets this right, because he's involved in a lot of that research around that sort of stuff, really. Yeah. But I think he also believes, of course, that it's a computational Bayesian searching model. He agrees with these computational people. And because he was a psychologist originally, he's contributing to this debate. Yeah. So he's not only they call him the grandfather of AI. He may be the grandfather of this new school of thought in psychology.
Yeah, well, let's hope he doesn't decide he's going to kind of build chairs and go back to carpentry and carry on. So we're toggling around, in a way, between the development of AI and the development of new ideas about the brain. So the one is feeding into the other. Yeah. Are we ready to move on to Chater?
Chater, yeah.
Giving us the black mind.
Yeah.
Chater was born in England, grew up in the Midlands. He studied psychology at the University of Cambridge and received his PhD from the University of Edinburgh. He has held academic positions at the University of Warwick and is currently a professor at the University of Oxford. His work focuses on the cognitive and computational model of decision-making and language. And he wrote this revolutionary book, which Donald will tell us about. Fun fact, he's a jazz pianist and has performed in various ensembles, which makes you wonder if his theories about the improvised mind perhaps come from his interest in jazz. I mean, he talks a lot about Charlie Parker and so on. Jazz being at its heart an improvisatory form, of course. Donald, tell us about the flat mind. On the face of it, a concept which will seem to many as implausible as flat Earth theory.
Yeah, well, when I bought this book, I think it was 2018 or something it was published, and I read it quite recently. This is, honestly, it's a little thin book. Buy it. You know, when people say a book changed your life, it sort of changed my theoretical life anyway. I read it in one sitting because it sort of knocked all the beliefs I had about the brain to one side. It's called the flat mind. What did he mean by the flat mind? He basically thinks that the mind is a black box. We don't have access to how it works, really. We can't reflect. We don't know how our own brains work. But he says it's not as smart as you think it is. So we're dominated by vision. You're all sitting watching this and listening to us, but vision is the dominant perception, unless you're blind, of course. It's a dominant perception and it shapes cognition. But when he says it's flat, it means don't go on and start inventing things. He thinks the last several centuries in psychology have just been the inventing of bullshit. He says, we build these models like Bloom or something, you know, that stupid coloured pyramid. And then, of course, a few years later, we find out that it was bullshit, but we've been using it in PowerPoints and we carry on using it anyway. He's saying these models are all fictional. L&D is full of these models, you know, from Abraham Maslow's daft pyramid. Real life is nothing like that, a waste of time, through to Bloom. There's hundreds of them, you know. They're all either pyramids or little four-way grids. You know, train-the-trainer courses, that's it. You know, a series of those, basically. He says that the brain's nothing like that at all. It actually has no access to any of that stuff. We actually don't know how this works. But we do, from artificial intelligence, know that it uses a computational set of models. And so the Bayesian one is one. We know that works, the mathematics, and it's quite likely that something similar happens in the brain. But that's a flat mathematical thing. He then goes on to really explore how good the brain is, and it's shockingly bad. Our perceptions are limited. You know, we're making things up all the time. And then he starts to look at Freud and people like this and go, well, all that id, super-id stuff, those things don't actually exist, and yet they've been a dominant theory for about a century. And he starts to demolish traditional psychology brick by brick. Yeah. And you get to the end of the book and you're it's breathtaking, you know, if he's right. I'm not wholly convinced he's wholly right, but it's an amazing book to read if you're interested in the psychology of learning and you're involved in the learning game, I think.
Yeah. I have to say he is slightly more, I don't know, polite about Freud than you are, Donald. We've actually recorded these episodes out of sequence, and we've done the psychologists and the psychoanalysts.
Yeah.
So after this, next time, you'll get Donald's demolition of Freud. But I watched I watched Chater on YouTube answering questions about things like this, and he's got a lot of time for Freud because Freud's a very good writer, but he thinks that we should put him in the fiction shelves alongside Tolstoy. It's a story about our feelings and emotions and perceptions and all the rest of it, but it kind of belongs with literature. And Freud, I think, would possibly agree with him. He in the end, he knew that he wasn't a scientist. But could you explain a little bit more about how Chater thinks that the brain works? He had an interesting thing about it being like a load of drops going from one drop to another.
Correct.
Going down.
Yeah, so he thinks we have very fragmented experience and we flip from one thing to another because we're very inattentive.
Yeah.
So, you know, when you're having a conversation with somebody and suddenly your mind drifts and you're looking over their shoulder, the brain is a very inattentive entity.
Yeah.
And it's not like a computer which has 100% attention all of the time, because it's deterministic in that sense. So he sort of shakes us out this illusion. He thinks it is an illusion that the brain gives us continuous rational experience. He calls it bounded rationality. In other words, we don't think reasonably at all. We don't think through reason. So and AI is a really interesting area. I get all these questions about ethics in the AI, and people think they're very rational in ethics, but they're not really. They're just expressing their emotions. They don't like AI, so they want to demolish it because it's, biased or something. You can feel it. It's their feelings. It's not reason. Because when you ask them, well, in what way is it biased? Is it mathematically biased, or is it cognitive? They're completely lost. They haven't really thought it through. So the brain is a very surface phenomenon, if you want to call that, a reaching, probing. The word he uses is improvisational. The brain has had to evolve, remember as Dennett said, to improvise, to be able to cope with new things. It doesn't cope very well with consistent rational thought, like a computer. And I think he's right on that. People are not rational beings. I used to study philosophical logic as a subject where you get arguments and you break them down into pure Boolean logic. Nobody I've ever met is very good at that subject because the brain is crap at it. And I think that's his big breakthrough here. Yeah. He has a second thing on language. He thinks Chomsky was all wrong. So
Chomsky as well. God, the sacred cows are dying in the paddocks here.
But Chomsky thought there was an underlying sort of module around language, which is why babies can pick it up so quickly. There's not enough data to explain why they pick up.
You've got the machinery inside you for grammar already.
But he picks up on it. It was Captain Cook, when he went to the South Sea Islands, landed on this island, and the natives are there with spears ready to kill them. And then Captain Cook had his gun and dropped it on the sand. And the natives looked and went, oh, that's interesting. They dropped their spear. And he describes it as Captain Cook in his diary said, we were playing charades. And then they never learned the language, but they managed to do trade and exchange and get a meal without ever having spoken each other's language. Nick Chater picked up on this with a guy called Mortensen from the States and thought, actually, that may be how we acquire language. It's almost like an elaborate game of charades.
Yeah.
Where that's how young babies acquire language, especially with their mother, father, siblings, and peer groups. It's a very interesting because it really rocked the linguistics world, this.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are sort of swinging around to the Chater type model on that. So he had a double. Now, that's an interesting thing because I think his theory of the flat mind, the mind is an improvisational thing, and it managed to communicate with people in another language. That gave him a clue to how language may be learned.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that his experimental kind of work that lies behind this theory is based on misperceptions.
Yes, it is.
And mistakes. Yeah. And there's I hate to keep harping on about Freud, but there is a kind of parallel there because you read the introductory lectures and Freud is big on parapraxes, which is some of the most interesting stuff that he writes. So, he's a very good writer. And the Chater stuff is, he shows a lot of visual illusions, for instance, as examples of how we're continually getting things wrong. But from that, he builds up a real sense of
the brain
is not there.
That's absolutely spot on. The book's full of wonderful examples of that. So the brain's a projecting thing, and if the real world doesn't match your existing perceptions, it throws you. I'll give you a really good example of it. 2 nights ago, I was in Ghent in a hotel, and I went to my room, and the television was on. We had a few beers. It was Belgium. I went back to my room. The television was on. I had to get to sleep, and I couldn't get it off. I couldn't find the remote control. So normally in a hotel room, it's on below the television or on the desk. It's visible, or in a hole. I was in the toilet under my bed. I put a towel over the television. Didn't work. I eventually had to get my hand up behind it because it was flat and almost electrocute myself and pull the power out. I went back to my bed. This took me about half an hour, and I was too embarrassed to phone reception in case I was some daft old man. There it is. Sure enough, I went back to my bed. It was on the little table on the other side. Because my brain is a Bayesian prediction model. I expected the remote control to be there or there, and then I knew, I had only looked at the table on my side of this enormous bed, and it was just tucked in on the other side. It was almost a perfect example of how the brain we're stupid, really. Yeah. And it's a Bayesian prediction model. And, another famous one is, how many men can't find things in a fridge? It happens to me all the time. Sorry, there's no butter in the fridge. My wife goes in and just picks it straight off the shelf. I have no idea why this happens, but I clearly have a stupid Bayesian model that expects the butter to always be there when it's over here and I don't look.
She bought a different brand and the packaging was a different colour.
How dare she?
To me all the time.
How dare she?
Yeah.
But I think, people laugh there because we've all been there a little bit, But there are loads of examples in life that he brings to the surface to show how primitive and improvisational the brain is. Which
Yeah,
is
it's interesting. I was in the same hotel as you in Belgium. I thought it was very nice. It was a boutique hotel.
Yeah.
And I found the remote control was beside my bed, just like that. And I think the reason is I'm a brand person. I've kind of grown up as a marketing person. I loved the hotel. I loved the copy, the fonts, the way it's furnished. I bought into the brand promise. When I was looking for the remote control, I thought, they've thought through their user journey. It will be beside the bed. Anyway, we should move on to Karl Friston.
Yeah.
Karl Friston was born in London, raised in the UK. He studied medicine at King's College London and later specialised in psychiatry, interestingly enough. Friston is a professor at University College London, known for developing statistical parametric mapping and the free energy principle in neuroscience. You will explain to us what those are about, so I don't get it. Fun fact, Friston initially wanted to be an artist and still engages in artistic activities as a hobby. Interesting that Chater was a jazzer. So, Donald, what does Friston add to this story?
Well, Friston's interesting because he's the first in this group of the Connectionists that bring all of this together to give us, his book's called The Free Energy Principle, a unified theory of the brain. So he brings all this stuff together to give us one theory based around, it actually comes from a German psychologist called Helmholtz in the 19th century. So the free energy principle is the idea that my brain, like take the remote, we'll continue the remote control story. My brain is trying to find the remote control. That's my expectation. It's a Bayesian predicting model. It doesn't quite work. There is a gap between that and what actually happened. Eventually I find it and I close that gap. He thinks that the brain does that all the time in a super fast fashion. In fact, we're doing it without realizing it all the time. You're doing it right now. In other words, the free energy principle is a sort of theory of mathematics, which means the brain is constantly minimizing the errors. So, you know, a good example would be, have you ever smashed your nose into the door because you didn't see the glass? That's a perfect example because our brain is, oh, look, I want to go there, boom, I didn't see the glass. As soon as you hit that thing, your brain goes, holy shit. You know, you hit the shock and you go, oh yeah, it's a window. You're slightly embarrassed, you move on. But he thinks that explains our whole being in the world as we move through the world, as you go out to have your coffee today. The reason you get through that door is you're doing that all the time, like a supercomputer. And he thinks that's what the brain is. The free energy principle, it's called. It's very, very clever. But the nice thing about it is he's defined it mathematically. So he has a good theory here because he can show you it. He can show you it for real. How many psychologists can do that? Not many. And that's why Friston has become a big name in this area. Some people have criticised him because the maths is quite obtuse. I don't understand it, but those that do, some doubts as to whether he's right or not. But anyway, that's science. You know, we'll move on. But I think he's the first person to give us the unified theory in this field.
Right. Okay. And this free energy thing, is this to do with what you're talking about? The brain is very low powered. It requires very little electricity to
when
run.
he uses the word energy, it's not in that sort of literal sense of watts or power or whatever you might want to explain it, energy in the brain. It's really a mathematical principle rather than energy as such.
Okay.
But there is another angle to this as well because the brain is a very low powered machine. It doesn't need much energy.
Yes.
There's a good reason why it does this. It has to have a super efficient algorithm to survive in the world. So these things are evolved. Remember going back to Dennett?
Yeah.
In his book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea. Behind all this is the shadow of Darwin.
Yeah.
Which I think is also good because I think Darwin was right.
Right. Does his work point out the fact that a brain can, the large language model takes a lot of input to make the inferences. The brain can make inferences based on far fewer instances. It doesn't need to read a million documents. It can, have read two or three books and then make inferences from that.
Now that's the next person, so that was a nice segue there to
Let's
Josh
move
Tenenbaum.
on.
Yeah, Josh Tenenbaum says exactly that.
Okay.
Because kids need what they call one or two shot experience. We'll come on to that. Joshua
Brett Tenenbaum, 1972, was born, still among us, like so many of these guys. He was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and grew up in the greater Boston area, studied computer science at Yale, earned his PhD in cognitive science from MIT. Roll call of universities here. Tenenbaum is a professor at MIT, focusing on computational models of human cognition and machine learning. Fun fact, he's interested in sci-fi and draws inspiration from science fiction literature for his research ideas. So, Donald, we had a jazzer, we've had an artist. Do Tenenbaum's ideas about building advanced AIs similarly take us into the realms of science fiction?
Oh, not far from it. So, Josh Tenenbaum at MIT said, there's a funny thing here, because babies don't, like, okay, Karl, okay, Daniel Dennett, okay, Nick Chater, but what about babies? They seem to, there's a very peculiar phenomenon in psychological development of very young children, is you can show them a picture of a tiger just once, and then they know what other tigers are. It's called one shot. You get one shot learning. It's a really amazing ability. Nobody quite knows why this is true. Now, this has been explored by the AI people, so you have 1 and 2 and 3 shot systems that work in AI. And Josh Tenenbaum is trying to build AI computers that learn like babies, and there are actually several projects worldwide that have taken the idea of the brain of a baby, and you're just teaching it like a baby to evolve into an adult. This is really interesting if it works, because these things will just grow and become incredibly clever, just like us. And he thinks this is necessary. Another guy who thinks this is necessary, Yann LeCun, I don't know if you heard that name, but he's the head of AI at Facebook, and he is one of the 3 geniuses of AI who got the Nobel Prize in AI, along with Geoffrey Hinton and a guy called Bengio. So there are 3, the top guys. He also believes this, that you really have to understand how babies learn and how humans and animals learn to get brilliant AI. And you have to train them in that way. But we're already getting there with a 1 and 2 shot solution type stuff. Tenenbaum also believes there's a thing called a core common sense module in the brain. In other words, human beings actually have things that we don't seem to teach them, but young babies and children have it, which machines don't have. They're undiscriminating. But young kids very quickly have a model. They know that their mother is another human being, or father. They know that the mother has a mind. It's a bit of a puzzle, this. I know it sounds a bit obvious, but actually it's a bit of a puzzle. How does a baby know that any other thing in the world has a mind like it?
Yeah,
but it seems to know it.
Doesn't that has to evolve? When the baby's first born, it doesn't make a separation between itself and the mother, does it?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't seem to be a wholly learned phenomenon, interestingly. It seems to be more innate. So it seems to be in the black box as opposed to a learnt phenomenon. There are ways you can test whether it is one or the other. Now, Tenenbaum thinks that this is true, as does Yann LeCun, and Yann LeCun has all the resources of Facebook and is looking at this problem. Because if we manage to get a common sense core in this, then your large language models aren't as scatty or hallucinatory as they sometimes are at the moment. Actually, scale seems to be solving that problem anyway, so it might not be necessary. Some people believe that's true, but people like Tenenbaum and Yann LeCun thinks that we've got to focus on, some of those things I talked to you about, understanding context. Kids understand the context of the world without you having to tell them. By scrabbling about the place. Some of the things, the brain just, the famous test when you take a young baby, and there's a glass, and they don't go over the edge, but they eventually learn that it's glass and they can crawl over the glass, that sort of test. That doesn't seem to be all learned behavior. Some of it is innate. And so the innate side of it is what Yann LeCun and Josh Tenenbaum are looking at. And if that breakthrough comes along, that will be amazing. But I think we're already seeing it, and I showed an example of that from Google Project Astra, I think.
Okay. Unfortunately, we have to jog along here. Andy Clark, 1957, contemporary of ours, so still among us. Andy Clark was born in Lanark, Scotland, and grew up in various parts of the UK, studied philosophy at the University of Stirling, PhD from the University of Sussex, my alma mater. Clark has held academic positions at the University of Sussex, Washington University in St. Louis, and the University of Edinburgh. He's known for his work on the philosophy of mind, particularly the concept of extended cognition. Fun fact, Clark is a fan of cyberpunk literature. and believes it offers valuable insights into the future of human-machine interactions. Donald, we covered Andy Clark before, for Great Minds on Learning, an episode about the extended mind. But how should his thought extend our minds when it comes to thinking about a flat, improvisatory mind?
Well, so he's one of these people who believe in the computational theory of the mind. Let's park that for a moment. What does he bring to the table? Some really interesting thoughts about mental illness. So my sister was a psychiatric nurse, and it was amazing being out in the street. She could spot people with schizophrenia in the street because she had worked for 30 years with schizophrenics. And homeless people are quite often schizophrenic, and not all, but she was just finely tuned. There's an amazing ability. And I learned so much from her about what mental illness was. But Andy Clark thinks that mental illness is not, as most psychiatry believes, the sort of Freudian type, ghosts in the machine. He thinks that when people hallucinate, for example, and hearing voices is a really interesting phenomenon, he thinks that that's just the computational Bayesian prediction model misfiring or going wrong. So it's making things up. It's trying to fill in the blank. What is this? And he also thinks that's true of taking drugs, for example. What it does is just change the circuitry. So your Bayesian prediction model is a bit screwed up. So if you take acid, you start seeing notes coming out the speaker and everything seems a bit weird. Not that I've ever taken acid. Anyway, but the interesting thing about moving on from that is the way in which dreams work. So dreams are a bit weird, aren't they? Why do they happen and so on? And we've got the Freudian explanation is complete bullshit, of course. Actually, a nice explanation is as you're falling asleep in REM sleep, you're waking up slightly and your brain starts to try and predict out into the world, if that's true, but it doesn't find anything. So it just starts making stuff up. It's a wonderful, the Bayesian model, or the active inference model, it's much wider, is a wonderful model for explaining all these phenomena. Drug taking, the effects of drugs anyway, hallucinogenic drugs, mental illness, as well as dreams. And so he's written quite a lot about this. His recent book is really, really good on this. And that's what I like about these people. They seem to give me real answers to these questions, as opposed to bullshitty, oh yeah, it's an id or an ego or some other sort of creature from the deep.
This has been a really interesting kind of saunter through AI, philosophy, and ideas about the brain, psychology. What are the implications of this for learning? I mean, is this knowing this going to change the way that L&D people start operating when they get up in the morning, and how will it affect the way that we...
I honestly think it does. So at the end of all this journey, I started to reflect on that for a moment. I think there's some really practical things. We could have a whole podcast on this. If I was sitting in L&D...
Probably will, folks.
I would say, what you can learn from that? One is that I actually think it supports, that's why I've swung radically towards the performance support thing, because if the brain is an improvising predictive machine, actually, and I've always believed this is true anyway, it will learn best in context while you're doing the job, which is task focused and not in a course. A second big thing is less is more. Stop bombarding people with courses that have got too much in them too quick, because the brain will not learn any of that stuff. Bob talked about it on the leadership thing. Those leadership courses that people are going to walk out is not going to make a damn bit of difference to them. They may pick up a couple of aperçus, like be nice to people or something, but you're not going to walk out there and become Elon Musk.
Yeah. For the tape, Donald is gesturing towards Bob Mosher, who's been on this road trip in Europe with us. And I thought you were in your own session at the moment. It was the parallel session to this, Bob. So what are you doing here?
I love it. This is way better than mine.
I
was boring myself.
Not true at all.
But I think another thing that it taught me is the importance of a frictionless interface, like get to the learning, get rid of the interfaces, forget about UX designers and menu structures and little cartoons and all that, like dump that. It's not what the brain wants. And then the big one for me is I think we've got to stop fooling ourselves into thinking that we're going to teach all these that the brain works this way. Let me give you an example, because there are many, I think. Leadership's one, but values is another one. I don't know what it's like in the Netherlands, but the L&D world has gone crazy in teaching people values. All companies, HR and L&D departments are creating these lists of values, and they're all abstract nouns. And nobody in the organization can ever remember them. If you ask them, they never remember them. but it's not how the brain works. You don't remember an abstract word and then you have like integrity and suddenly you have integrity. In fact, when you ask somebody, I did it yesterday, I can't remember, I said, what are your values? And they go, oh, I don't know. You know, I have no idea. If you said to me, what are your values? I have no idea. But to be honest, I don't care. If I'm employing you, I don't care what your values are. Because I doubt if you even know what they are yourself. And there's certainly not going to be a little list all beginning with C or I. And so I think we're just teaching bullshit these days in these courses. I think it's just like we're making shit up, putting them on as PowerPoint slides and pretending they matter.
We had a conversation yesterday about how different personal values are from, say, organizational values. Organizational values come in bullet points on a chart. Your personal values are rather difficult to work out. And it reminded me of something that Nick Chater said about Hobbes. He said, the Hobbesian thing is that there's a social contract, which is a bargain between state power and the individual's need for security and so on. And he said there was never a moment when everybody sat down and thrashed out this social contract. He said it happens through millions of human interactions, little things like, oh, do I hold a door open for this person? And it's kind of built up from that. And he said we should think of ourselves, society, as more like termites.
Yes.
And ants and a termite hill. I thought it was absolutely fascinating way of thinking about politics.
Well, I am a Hobbesian. I do agree he was right on this.
Yeah.
Hobbes very famously said that the nation state really matters. In other words, the unit really matters, which is why he would never have believed in the success of the EU. Neither do I, by the way. I think it will collapse, but that's another point. But I think he thought that there was this emergent quality in people that they learn from others and so on. That's why we shouldn't get carried away by these abstractions all the time, turn them into courses and shove them down people's throats, because that's not how the brain works. If these people are right, it's definitely not how the brain works, because you don't actually behave ethically by remembering an abstract noun and recalling it into your mind and behaving accordingly. It's just not how it works. Actually, moral behaviour is a lot to do with feelings, which goes back to Hume. He wrote a whole book on this. So it's a good question, this, because there's loads of consequences, but by and large, less is more, active learning, performance support, stop teaching abstract nouns. That's the big lessons here. This is good, actually, because I think we can cut to the quick. When I first came in at L&D 40 years ago, that's what we did. We taught competencies for real people in real jobs. And then I look at courses now and I go, I've been to several leadership courses. Honestly, it makes me weep. And I've led companies all my life.
So anyway, I think there's a strong message there. Listen to the research, and we should really listen to the research, and we should listen to Great Minds on Learning every episode. So we hope you'll tune in. Thank you very much for coming on this journey with us about the flat minds. Our minds are flatter than we thought, but they're just as intricate and interesting, and we'll continue to develop our thinking about them. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Donald, for this epic morning you've had of back-to-back sessions and telling us so much about
Thank you, John. Yeah.
Connectionists.
Thanks for coming along, folks.
Great Minds on Learning comes from the Learning Hack team and is produced by John Helmer. The podcast is based on a series of blog posts written by Donald Clark, and we thank Donald for his kind collaboration in this project. If you'd like text summaries and transcripts for these podcasts, as well as ads-free listening, early access to episodes and more, why not join the Learning Hack Pack? For less than the price of a coffee, you can get all these benefits and help to sustain us into the future. Go to patreon.com/learninghack for a 7-day free trial. That's patreon.com/learninghack.